Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ronald Reagan, ColumbiaDC board member and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to thank our partners for this evening, Princeton Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for joining us. We are very privileged to have Randall Balmer, John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College, to talk about the Evangelicals, the real origins of the religious right, and why it matters. Please briefly allow me to introduce Professor Balmer, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for his full list of works and full bio. Professor Balmer was professor of religion in North America at Columbia before coming to Dartmouth in 2012. And he has been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, and Emory universities. Also, he has been a visiting professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. And he's the author of many books, including Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter, and most recently, Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of Religious Right. His commentaries on religion in America appear in newspapers across the country, including the LA Times and Washington Post. So without further ado, Professor, you're all ears.
All right, thank you. Thank you for joining with this. I'm particularly happy, in addition, that the Princeton people are here. It wasn't mentioned in the bio, but I did my doctorate work at Princeton. And I'm going to also add that my most recent book is not Bad Faith, actually. As of this week, I have a new book out called Passion Plays, How Religion Shaped Sports in North America. And that was really inspired by my graduate days at Princeton and playing on the history department softball team, but that's a longer story that I won't get into today. I'm very happy to be here with the Columbia University people, and I remember very fondly several visits to DC and when I was a professor at Columbia, and Lou Mendelson being a very gracious host during my time there. I also remember one of the visits to the Columbia Club in DC was actually the same night of the vice presidential debate in 1988, when you'll perhaps remember Dan Quayle made a remark about John Kennedy, and Lloyd Bentsen, the Democratic nominee, U.S. Senator from Texas, looked at Quayle and said, Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. It was kind of a moment, a memorable moment in that debate. I want to talk a little bit about the other book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, which is really the topic of our conversation tonight, and say that this book really began on a visit to Washington, D.C. a couple of years later. That is 2 years after my visit there with the Alumni Club in 1988. In the November of 1990, I was still at Columbia. I was an assistant professor at Columbia, and I got an invitation to a gathering in Washington. And I remember debating up until the last moment whether or not I was going to accept this invitation. I was teaching at the time and trying to do some writing, also had a young family. And I remember dithering all the way to the end whether or not I was going to go. I decided finally to go. And I got to Washington, found myself in a hotel conference room with the real leaders of the religious right. Ralph Reed was there, head of the Christian Coalition. Ed Dobson, who had been one of Jerry Falwell's acolytes at Moral Majority. Donald Wildman, the founder of the American Family Association. This is the religious right group that did all the TV boycotts back in the 1980s. Carl F.H. Henry, the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, was there. Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Paul Weyrich, who was really the architect behind the religious right. So I found myself in this gathering in a closed door meeting in Washington, D.C. And it turned out that I discovered the real purpose of the meeting was to celebrate the election of Ronald Reagan as president 10 years earlier. Well, I hadn't celebrated 10 years before, and I wasn't in any particular mood to celebrate 10 years later, but I thought, well, I'm here, I'll try to make the best of this. So I settled in for this conversation for this discussion. And in the very first session, in the course of the discussion, Paul Weyrich, who, as I said, was from the Heritage Foundation, one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation, and really the organizational genius behind the religious right, made an impassioned statement. He said, let's remember that our movement, meaning the religious right, did not organize, did not galvanize in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. Not at all. That's not what got us active politically. And very soon thereafter, Ed Dobson, who, as I said, was one of Falwell's lieutenants at Moral Majority, quickly concurred with what Weyrich had said. So the discussion continued, and finally there was a break between sessions, and I went to Weyrich and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly, that abortion had nothing whatsoever to do with the catalyst, as a catalyst for the religious right. And he said, absolutely not. He was equally passionate in a private conversation. Absolutely not. What got us going as a political movement was our defense of evangelical institutions from the Internal Revenue Service in the 1970s. Well, that got me started. That conversation got me started on a multi-year, really multi-decade quest to uncover the real origins of the religious right. We all know that the mythology that has grown up around this movement, frequently stoked by people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and others, is that evangelicals, having been politically somnolent for the middle decades of the 20th century, suddenly sprung to life in the 1970s in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. And some of these evangelicals even went so far as to characterize themselves as the so-called new abolitionists, trying to draw a parallel between their opposition to abortion and the opposition of 19th century evangelicals to the scourge of slavery. Well, Weyrich got me going in that direction to see if that was really true. And I have to say that I grew up, and this is probably more autobiographical than it need to be, but nevertheless, let me set the background. I grew up within what I call the evangelical subculture, which is this vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, Bible camps, seminaries, Christian colleges, publishing houses, missionary societies, and so forth. That was constructed, the subculture was constructed really in earnest roughly after the Scopes trial of 1925. And it was a defensive posture to keep evangelicals from a great deal of interaction with the broader culture. So it was possible, as I can attest personally, to grow up within that subculture in the middle decades of the 20th century and have very little commerce with anyone outside of that subculture, outside of that world. And so I say that only to emphasize that in the 1970s, I was really embedded in a serious way in that subculture. This has been my childhood as well. But in the 1970s, I went off to a small Christian college in Northern Illinois, and then stayed on working at the sister institution, which was an evangelical seminary, while also doing a master's degree in church history at that seminary. And my point in saying this is that when Weyrich made that statement, it rang true with me. That is to say, I don't remember fellow evangelicals being exercised about abortion throughout the 1970s, during that time when I was very seriously involved in that world. And so as I began to look further into it, I came to uncover what I've since called the abortion myth. That is the fiction that evangelicals became involved politically in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade. And let me cite a little bit of this evidence. In 1968, Again, this is well before Roe v. Wade. The flagship magazine of evangelicalism, Christianity Today, convened a meeting or a conference with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society in order to discuss issues surrounding abortion, to decide whether or not it was a moral issue. And 20-some heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world gathered for this conversation, and they kicked it around for several days. And at the end of their conference, they issued a statement saying, we really can't decide whether abortion is a moral issue. Let me read a portion of their statement here. Whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed, the statement read, but about the necessity of it and permissibility for it under certain circumstances, we are in accord. 1970, the United Methodist Church, which has deep roots within evangelicalism, although in many ways it has moved away from that, issued a statement, a resolution, calling for the legalization of abortion. So too, in 1971, did the Southern Baptist Convention, meeting in St. Louis. The delegates there, they call them messengers, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, a year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention is not exactly known as a redoubt of liberalism, but in 1971, again, confirmed in 74 and 1976, the Southern Baptists called for the legalization of abortion. When the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, several prominent evangelicals, first of all, most evangelicals were silent about the issue. They considered abortion a Catholic issue throughout most of the 1970s. But when the decision was handed down, several evangelicals issued statements applauding the Roe v. Wade decision, including W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, and a previous president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Even James Dobson, who later, of course, became an implacable foe of abortion, in 1973 said, or acknowledged, that the Bible was silent on the matter of abortion, and that therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe, quote, that a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26th, 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. This is why I call it the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals became involved in politics in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. That raises the question, of course, what happened? Why did they galvanize as a political movement? Again, the background is that evangelicals were largely apolitical from roughly the 1920s through the 1970s. Or ironically, paradoxically, one of the catalysts for their reemergence into public life was the presidential campaign of a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher in 1976, Jimmy Carter, an evangelical born-again Christian, just like evangelicals would describe themselves. Well, what really happened? The catalyst for the religious right was a court decision, but it was not a Supreme Court decision. It was not Roe v. Wade. It was a lower court decision rendered by the District Court for the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1971, a case called Green v. Connolly. Now, let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the background behind Green v. Connolly. The deep background, of course, was the Brown decision of May 17th, 1954, which called for the desegregation of public education in America. We all know that story. And then 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act that forbade discrimination, racial discrimination in public institutions. Well, what was happening by the late 1970s is that a lot of these school districts were finally desegregating in obedience to the court order. And down in Holmes County, Mississippi, the number of white students in the public school system dropped from over 700 to 28 during the first year of desegregation. The second year of desegregation, that number of white students in the public school system dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 segregation academies, church-sponsored, were applying to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And a group of families in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this isn't right. So they filed suit. That suit was joined with another suit. I expect there's probably some legal folks here in this Zoom call who could fill in more details if you want. But the case went through several iterations of the courts and was joined with another case. And it came up before the district court for the District of Columbia in a case called Green V Connolly. On June 30th, 1971, the district court for the District of Columbia ruled, in effect, that any institution or organization that engages in racial segregation is not, by definition, a charitable institution, and therefore has no claims on tax-exempt status. That was the effect of Green v. Connolly in 1971. And I'm going to make a parenthetical comment here to say that it had long eluded me why the Green v. Connolly ruling did not receive more attention when it was handed down by the district court in the District of Columbia until just a few weeks ago, actually. One of the courses I began teaching a few years ago is a course on the 1960s. And in the course of preparing my lectures for that class on the 1960s, I came across the fact that on June 30th, 1971, the same day as the Green v. Connolly ruling, that was when the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Pentagon Papers case that vindicated the New York Times and allowed the Times to proceed with the publication of the Pentagon Papers. So I think that's one of the reasons that the Green v. Connolly ruling hasn't received as much notice as it probably deserves. But on the basis of that ruling, first of all, Richard Nixon, the president at the time, instructed the IRS not to issue any further tax exemptions to these racially segregated institutions. But the IRS then began to look at these other institutions and to inquire about their racial policies to see whether or not they engaged in racial segregations. One of the targets was, not surprisingly, Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. And they responded rather defiantly, yes, we segregate, we discriminate against African Americans, we keep them separate because the Bible tells us to do that. Of course, that's a specious argument, of course, but nevertheless, that was their response. And so over the course of the 1970s, the IRS began to crack down on these racially segregated evangelical institutions. And that got the attention of certain evangelical leaders, including a minister from Lynchburg, Virginia, Jerry Falwell, who had opened his own segregation academy back in 1967. And that, according to Paul Weyrich and according to others, and according to a great deal of historical research, that was the catalyst for the mobilization of evangelicals politically in the 1970s. Had nothing whatsoever to do with abortion. Well, what happened? Paul Weyrich, I sometimes call him an evil genius because he was awfully savvy and very, very, very clever. He recognized early on that if he was going to mobilize grassroots evangelicals, he needed an issue other than defense of racial segregation. Weyrich had been trying to mobilize evangelical voters all the way back to the Goldwater campaign in 1964. This was actually part of the conversation I had with him at that conference back in November 1990. And he told me, again, quite emphatically, he said, I tried everything to get these people interested in politics. He said, I tried the school prayer issue, which of course was the big issue in the early 1960s. I tried the pornography issue. I tried the abortion issue. I tried all these, the issue of women's rights and women's equality. I tried that issue as well. Nothing got their attention, meeting evangelical leaders, until the IRS began making these overtures and inquiries into the racial status of these evangelical institutions in the 1970s. But Weyrich also recognized, as I said earlier, that galvanizing a movement around a defense of racial segregation was probably dicey. You can certainly get the leaders of the movement interested because of their self-interest, their own schools that had shady racial policies. But if he was going to galvanize grassroots evangelicals, he needed an issue other than defense of racial segregation. So he made two moves, which really were quite remarkable. The first was quite decisive and quite intentional on his part. The second one, he kind of fell into it. First was, rather than couching this issue as a defense of racial segregation, he very quickly shifted the rhetoric to say, this is a defense of religious freedom, thereby writing the page from the modern contemporary religious right playbook. We're not defending racial segregation. We're defending religious freedom. Now, that claim had some merit. And let me again draw on my childhood to illustrate that. My father, for 40 years, was a minister in the Evangelical Free Church of America. He's now deceased. And I remember very often during my childhood, a president of a Bible institute or a Christian college would be traveling in the area, stop by my father's congregation, usually on a Sunday evening. We had Sunday evening services as well as Sunday morning services, in addition to several other times a week, but that's a whole other story. And these presidents, these college or Bible Institute presidents, would be trying to raise money or also recruit students to their schools. Most of the schools were quite small. And I remember very clearly one of the talking points, and this was true of virtually everyone, was a point of pride. We don't accept any money from the federal government, therefore the government cannot tell us how to run our shop. That is to say, the government can't tell us who to hire, who to fire, who to admit and not to admit. There's always a point of pride. We don't accept any money from the federal government. And so Weyrich's couching the issue as a matter of religious freedom had some plausibility to it, although what he failed to recognize, or what he failed to acknowledge, is that public subsidy in the form of tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. And we all know that, right? Tax exempt institutions, whether they are colleges or universities or churches or whatever it might be, don't pay taxes. They might contribute voluntarily to help support the local police or fire department, but they're not obligated to pay taxes, which means that the rest of the citizens have to pony up a little bit more in order to subsidize these charitable institutions, these tax-exempt institutions. But Weyrich was very careful to frame this as an assault on our religious freedom. The IRS is coming after us. Again, this rhetoric is going to sound very, very familiar in the contemporary context as well. So that was his first move. His second move really was quite by chance, quite by accident. Weyrich, and again, he's talked about this, and he mentioned this in our conversation. He said, in advance of the 1978 midterm elections, he went to the head of the Republican National Committee. At that time was Bill Brock, the former Republican senator from Tennessee. And Weyrich asked Brock for some money so that he could use that money to organize evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at Weyrich and said, "Who are these people? Are you crazy? I'm not going to give you money for this." Whereupon Weyrich, again, according to his own account, resolved to go out and elect some rather improbable people in the midterm elections of 1978. They concentrated on 4 Senate races. One of them in New Hampshire, Thomas McIntyre was running for re-election, Democratic senator. One of them in Iowa, where Dick Clark, not the entertainer Dick Clark, but Democratic senator from Iowa, who had won his previous election with 55% of the vote. He was running for re-election in 1978. And then 2 Senate races in Minnesota, one of them for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who of course was Jimmy Carter's vice president. In all of those races, pundits and polls showed the Democratic candidates prevailing, winning fairly easily in most cases. However, the final weekend of that midterm election campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 of the favored Democratic nominees lost to anti-abortion Republicans. Dick Clark, by the way, was quite explicit about this. This is why I lost the election, is because of those pamphlets, because of the anti-abortion leafleting. I remember very clearly going through Paul Weyrich's papers in the time surrounding the midterm elections of 1978. His papers are actually out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, of all places. And when I came across the correspondence surrounding that midterm election, it's almost like the papers began to sizzle, because Weyrich believed, he recognized that he finally found an issue that would galvanize grassroots evangelical voters. Nevertheless, 2 months later, beginning in January of 1979, a man by the name of Frank Schaeffer began traveling the country, touring the country with a series of films called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, arguably the godfather of the religious right, along with a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop. And as these films began to circulate to evangelical audiences in the first 3 months of 1979, the abortion issue began to gather some traction among evangelicals. Even so, Frank Schaeffer and I have talked about this at some length. Frank claims that the audiences for the most part were fairly tepid. Nothing comparing to the enthusiasm of an earlier film series he had done called How Shall We Then Live? As late as August 22nd, 1980, the abortion issue was still not being used by the Reagan-Bush campaign as an issue to rally evangelical voters. Some of you may remember that on August 22nd, 1980 is when Ronald Reagan addressed this huge rally at Reunion Arena in Dallas. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 evangelicals had gathered in an organization or a meeting called the National Affairs Briefing. And I looked through Reagan's speech out at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. And during that speech, he talked about creationism. He decried Jimmy Carter and his so-called unconstitutional assault on evangelical institutions through the Internal Revenue Service, the issue that had mobilized evangelical voters in the 1970s. And he made no mention whatsoever of abortion in that address. 10 to 20,000 screaming evangelicals This is the occasion where he went to the podium and he said, I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing, brought down the House and arguably sealed the evangelical vote for the 1980 presidential election. But significantly, Reagan did not mention abortion in that address in Dallas, Texas. Finally, what happens is that in the final weeks of the presidential campaign, in part because the Reagan-Bush camp was worried that they were not going to win the election, finally, they begin talking about the abortion issue. And then, of course, Reagan wins in a landslide, although going into that weekend before the voting, the polls showed both Reagan and Carter quite close, neck and neck. The final weekend, unfortunately for Jimmy Carter, coincided with the one-year anniversary of the taking of hostages in Tehran. The media played up the hostage situation, and Carter's favorability ratings plummeted in the final days of that election campaign. So it was not until really the early 1980s that abortion really becomes an issue for the religious right. And let me add one, or maybe two codas to that narrative. The meeting I mentioned, November of 1990, the closed-door meeting about to celebrate Reagan's election 10 years earlier. One of the recurring themes in the conversation, in the discussion there, was a lingering disappointment at Reagan for not prosecuting the religious right agenda as vigorously as they thought he would, or they came to believe that he would. Weyrich himself was one of the people who was quite disappointed with Reagan for focusing on economic issues rather than the social issues, including abortion. The other coda I'll add to that narrative is that, as some of you remember, the Bob Jones case, which went back to the early 1970s, as the IRS began to inquire about racial policies at Bob Jones University. Finally, after years of warnings, the IRS rescinded the tax exemption of Bob Jones University on January 19th, 1976. In the 1980 presidential campaign, Jimmy Carter was blamed over and over again for the IRS action against Bob Jones and these other institutions. However, if you think carefully about that date, January 19th, 1976, it was an important date for Jimmy Carter because it was the day he won the Iowa precinct caucuses, or he had a plurality in the Iowa precinct caucuses, the first step toward his nomination for president and his eventual election as president. But Jimmy Carter was not president on January 19th, 1976. He didn't take office until a year and a day after that, after the rescission of the tax-exempt status at Bob Jones University. Nevertheless, he was blamed for it in the 1980 presidential campaign. The Bob Jones case finally went before the Supreme Court in the fall of 1982, and in May of 1983, the Supreme Court issued its ruling 8-1 against Bob Jones University, ruling that Bob Jones University could not keep its racial policies as well as its tax exemption. The sole dissenter on that decision was Associate Justice William Rehnquist, the man Reagan later elevated to Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court. I'm not sure what my time here is. Do I need to go? Should I keep going? I can keep going, talking further, or I'd be happy to stop and entertain questions.
I think you have about 15 more minutes, and then we can switch to questions.
Keep going?
Yep, 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes, okay. All right. So as I said, I've been kind of trolling these waters for a long time. And as I was putting together this little book, and some of you may know that I'd done a Politico article on the origins of the religious right back in 2014, which I guess attracted some notice. At one time, Politico told me it was the most popular article they'd ever published. I'm sure that's no longer the case, but at one time they said it was. And in part because of the continuing interest in this issue about the origins of the religious right, I decided to put it all into a book and do it in a place where I could put footnotes in and have all of the scholarly apparatus to ensure people that I'm not making up this narrative, that it has a strong basis in fact and in history. So as I was writing this book, I was doing so, of course, with the retrospective of 81% of white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump for president in 2016, and again, a similar percentage in 2020, I think even actually a higher percentage in 2020. And trying to reconcile that with the origins of the religious right. Here you have a movement that had its origins in racism. And then you have this improbable, I mean, on the face of it, let's be honest about this. On the face of it, Donald Trump is not the traditional family values candidate. And this is a movement that for decades has been touting itself as a family values movement. And so I was trying to reconcile that and try to understand how we got from point A to point B. And it occurred to me in the course of writing this book that the real transitional figure here is Reagan himself. And as I looked a little bit more closely into Ronald Reagan's history and his career, it became clear to me that there's more than a coincidental juxtaposition of issues and concerns here. Reagan got into politics in California in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which sought to guarantee equal access to both rental housing as well as the purchase of housing. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. As president, he decimated the Civil Rights Commission. He maintained his support for the apartheid regime in South Africa long into the 1980s. And throughout his political campaigns, he frequently invoked the racially charged phrase law and order. And anyone who lived through that era can never forget his vile caricature of so-called welfare queens, women of color who were supposedly living the high life off of the public dole. He was never able to produce any of these welfare queens, but he talked as though they actually existed. And for me, I guess the most damning thing was his opening of his general election campaign in 1980, August 3rd, 1980, at the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, 3 civil rights workers, 2 Jews and an African-American, were abducted, tortured, and murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in collusion with the local sheriff's department. And Reagan, of course, was the master of symbolism. And lest anyone miss his meaning, he declared the age-old segregationist battle cry, "I believe in states' rights." Now, Reagan could have opened his general election campaign in any number of places. California, his adopted home state, would certainly have been a good place because California was very much in play in the 1980 presidential election. He could have gone to one of the Rust Belt cities that had been decimated by the economic distress of the 1970s. Instead, he chose, of all places, Philadelphia, Mississippi at the Neshoba County Fair. That, to me, is a pretty good indication of Reagan's sentiments on these particular matters. And so as I began to think about that, what is the connection between the origins of the religious right and the overwhelming white support for Donald Trump? in 2016 and 2020, I have to believe that one of the links in that loop has to be Ronald Reagan in his throughout his political career, but particularly in the 1980s. Now, all of this narrative, does this say that, does this mean that all evangelicals are racists? I don't believe that's the case at all. Again, I grew up within this movement. I think there are a lot of blind spots that many evangelicals have about racial matters, but I don't believe that evangelicals overwhelmingly are racist. Nevertheless, I think they need to come to terms with the origins of their political movement. The analogy I use in the book is that you could have this beautiful building, this beautiful structure, with all sorts of architectural niceties and filigree or whatever you consider to be a beautiful structure. But if that structure is resting on rotten timbers, as I believe the religious right is, then I believe the integrity of the entire structure is compromised. And that is what evangelicals need to come to terms with. So in part, what I've tried to argue in this book and elsewhere is that evangelicals need to connect with a more distant past. One of the things that's striking to me about evangelicalism as I study it, and I have for a number of years, in addition to coming out of that movement myself, one of the things that strikes me is that the disposition of 19th and early 20th century evangelicals towards society is far, far different from what we see with the religious right. What happened is that coming out of the Second Great Awakening, this series of revivals straddling the turn of the 19th century, evangelicals came to believe that they could construct a more godly society, but they directed their efforts more often than not toward those on the margins of society. And what they did was help to create the moral conscience for society. Evangelicals in the North, of course, were active in the crusade against slavery. We have to acknowledge that Southern evangelicals, some of them at least defended slavery. Some evangelicals also probably could be categorized as nativists, but evangelicals also were trying to improve the lot of those on the margins of society, whether it be people of color or immigrants. So one of the reasons that they were active in prison reform. They were active in defense of women's equality and women's rights, even voting rights in the 19th century, a rather radical idea at that time. Evangelicals were in the vanguard of many of those movements. They didn't always get it right by any stretch of the imagination. They had their faults, and I suppose we could talk about temperance as one of those faults, being paternalistic and overweening, but temperance was also an attempt to address very, very real problems of out-of-control alcohol consumption in the 19th century, with the concomitant problems of spousal abuse and child abuse, for example. So even that movement had its more benevolent roots, I think, in the 19th century. And I'll conclude with a more general observation. As someone who has studied American religious history for quite a while now, my sense is that religion or faith always functions best from the margins of society and not in the councils of power. That is, when religious individuals or religious groups begin to lust after political power or political influence, trying to gain proximity to politicians or people in power, I think they lose their prophetic voice. And I think one of the great tragedies of the religious right, aside from its origins, but one of the great tragedies of the religious right is that the religious right has defaulted, has surrendered its prophetic voice in society. And I would love nothing more than for them to recover it in one way or another. I think I'll leave it there if I may.
Great. Thank you so much. We had people writing in to say more earlier. So thank you for.
Okay.
Okay, so we already have 10 questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can in the next 45 minutes or so. But maybe we can start, since we have a couple coming in, and they really don't hold anything back here, all of our audience members. So we have a couple of questions on homosexuality. So it says, do you think that homosexuality and the fight for gay rights played a pivotal part in the rise of the religious right? And Stephen also says, you haven't mentioned that. When did the hatred of the gay agenda become a central part of the evangelical faith?
Yeah, the answer to the first part of that question is no, I don't think it did. And I cite as evidence for that Anita Bryant. That is to say, again, people who lived through that era will remember that one of the issues in the late 1970s, I think it began in 1977, was Anita Bryant having her anti-gay crusade down in Miami, Florida. Seeking to reverse and succeeding in reversing a measure. Again, I forget the governmental entities. I think believes that Miami-Dade County had passed a measure that guaranteed equality or civil rights to gays and lesbians, and Anita Bryant got all exercised over that and started a crusade that actually reversed that ruling, and that she tried to broaden that. But even Anita Bryant, and I have a quote from her in this book, even Anita Bryant acknowledged that the real issue that was motivating evangelical political activism in the late 1970s was the school issue, wasn't the gay rights issue. So it does eventually get cobbled into the agenda of the religious right, along with abortion and these other issues. But at the beginning, no, I don't believe it was. Now, another question I'm asked fairly frequently is, what role is that going to play going forward? And I think there's probably reason to believe that the religious right is going to hammer more solidly on that issue. I think in part because, well, the abortion issue is and is not a pressing issue for them. I mean, for the moment, they've won on the abortion issue. And it's even, as we know, backfiring on them in many ways. But they're going to need something else to keep the troops rallied. And issues of sexuality, in part because of their visceral nature, I think, are issues that tend to galvanize people and keep them riled up in one way or another. So my guess is that we'll see a kind of doubling down on the trans issue and whatever else they choose to emphasize these days that is sexual in one way or another.
One of the first questions that came in was, considering the SCOTUS majority is Catholic, does that confirm your assertion that Roe v. Wade was more of a Catholic issue?
Well, I think it does. And I think this is very interesting. If you look back at the last few Republican presidents, beginning with Reagan, so it'll be Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Trump, all of them owed their victories, and I think the polling data will bear this out, to the religious right. And more generally, the religious right has become the most reliable constituency of the Republican Party, much the way that rank and file union members were once the key constituency for the Democratic Party. So you look at those last four presidents, and their political debts were to evangelicals, to the religious right. And yet, when they made judicial appointments, they didn't choose evangelicals, strictly speaking. They went to Catholics. And I think the reason for that is that there was really no evangelical bench, no legal bench for them to draw on. And so what they've done, in effect, is sort of outsourced their judicial appointments to conservative Catholics. And of course, that's what we see overwhelmingly on the Supreme Court, a majority on the Supreme Court right now. And evangelicals are simply not there. Now, I think they are developing this bench. Places like Patrick Henry College, for example, which I've written about. When I was there visiting, the president told me that the thing he hears most frequently from parents of students at Patrick Henry College is, I want my child to be on the Supreme Court someday. So they're trying to move in that direction, but for the last 40 years at least, they haven't had a bench to draw from.
And just to clarify, when you talk about the religious right, are you defining it to include conservative Catholics or just evangelical Protestants?
Well, primarily evangelicals, although there's certainly, they call it a co-belligerency with the conservative Catholic. But I guess, as I've been talking about, it's primarily evangelicals who became politically active in the 1970s. It's an inexact term. There's no card carrying status for being part of the religious right. It's a generic term that refers to a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that are pushing for a particular agenda that they claim to be Christian or to be evangelical. By the way, I find the term Christian right, you talk about the Christian right, I find that deeply, deeply offensive. I think anybody who uses that term needs to explain to me what's Christian about the agenda that's being propagated by the religious right.
There was a comment that came in from Stella, and she said, I can see Weyrich's legacy in that many conservatives I know in Dallas have grown up being taught that Republican Party is on the side of God and that all Democrats are against religion. And she says that she agrees their first success was being able to elect Reagan.
Yeah, I didn't catch the last part of that.
Their success, the first success was electing Reagan.
Yes, exactly, right.
Okay, so then we had a question come in that says, how do you reconcile the sizable support among the deeply religious Hispanic population in the US on supporting evangelicals on their abortion posture, but still being naturally an outsider to that movement?
Yeah, that's really curious. It's obviously a growing constituency, both in the United States generally, but also for evangelicals. Again, I haven't studied this as much as I should have in order to render a credible answer to that question. But anecdotally, what I've observed is that a lot of Hispanics coming to the United States see Protestantism, and more particularly evangelicalism, as a kind of means of upward mobility. And in many cases, they associate Catholicism, I mean, unfairly, I want to be clear about that, but they associate Catholicism with the culture they're leaving behind, including the poverty that they're leaving behind. And so they see evangelicalism and, I suppose, a bit of the Protestant work ethic or something like that as being a vehicle for them to improve their lot here in the United States.
Okay, we have just questions coming in so fast, but let's see. Let's go with Edward asks, how is what the evangelicals did, leaving the inner city and founding suburban private schools that would be segregated, different from so many non-evangelical private schools that sprung up in the white suburbs? Was it merely a matter of the latter? Did not advertise that racism fleeing African Americans was their reason for being?
Well, I think the reasons probably were quite similar. I mean, you look at the Boston situation, for example, in the early 1970s, when the attempt was made to desegregate the public schools. I mean, there was a huge outcry. It was not only evangelicals who were upset about this, but they were upset about it. And the fact that they began to pursue tax exemption for these institutions is what really triggered this whole political movement.
So we have a couple questions about Trump and Pence. So maybe I'll start with Pence. Lydia says, you've spoken a great deal about Reagan and the evangelical right, but it seems that Pence had more proximal and direct influence on a number of evangelical groups who enabled the election of Trump in exchange for his pledged support of Supreme Court nominees who would overturn Roe. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Pence was really a fairly, a very savvy choice on Trump's part. because of his ties to the evangelical community, to the religious right community, and Pence what I found fascinating after the results of the 2016 election came in, and this overwhelming number or percentage of white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump, there was a kind of a frenzy to try to explain why this is, to justify themselves, because this is not the family values candidate. Let's be pretty clear about this. And you had all these tortured Bible interpretations about how Trump was King Cyrus from the Hebrew Bible, that is an unrighteous man, or less than righteous man, who nevertheless was able to do good things for Israel and that sort of thing. It's rather tortured, the logic behind it, but there was a lot of that going on. But in many ways, Pence, his very presence helped to justify that support that came Trump's way in 2016.
And do you think that was the main reason why evangelicals supported him so much, even though he hadn't really been associated with that group before running for office?
For Trump?
Yeah, was Pence that main reason?
Oh, yeah. Pence provided, at least a veneer of legitimacy, I think, for evangelical voters for Trump. But still, I've tried very hard to understand that political alliance, and it's just unless you begin to factor race and other issues into that, as I've tried to do here, even in this presentation, I think you're hard pressed to find a logical explanation for it.
Great. Okay, Saul says, regardless of how it all started, is it fair to say that opposition to abortion grew to become a core animating force of the religious right? Or is all this window dressing for what is fundamentally a movement driven by a lust for power coupled with racial animus?
No, I think, I should have been clear about this. I don't have any doubt that many evangelicals, probably most, maybe a super majority, have come to see abortion as this, kind of litmus test moral issue. I don't have any doubt about the sincerity of people in this anti-abortion crowd. I happen to think that their strategy is mistaken, but given the recent decision by the Supreme Court, I may be wrong about that as well. There's no question that evangelicals came to adopt abortion as a moral issue. Now, whether or not that is in some way a cover for ulterior motives, again, it's hard to generalize on that sort of thing. I think for many people it probably was, but I don't in any way want to impugn the sincerity of a majority of evangelicals and their feelings on the abortion issue.
Okay, we have a couple of questions coming in on the relationship of evangelicals to other groups. So maybe we can start with Miriam asked the relationship to the Q conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know anybody any more than anyone else does about this. That is to say that, there's certainly at least a correlation, whether or not there's some sort of causation behind that relationship. I really don't know. This stuff is so bizarre to me that I can't quite get my head around it in any way. But I will say generally that one of the things that has animated this movement, that is the religious right, from the beginning, or at least since the early 1980s, is this rhetoric of victimization. Our values are under attack. We are a minority, and so forth. And I think, by the way, I think that's one of the explanations for the support of Donald Trump, because I don't know anybody who speaks the rhetoric of victimization more fluently than Donald Trump. He's always the victim, of course, but there's something about that rhetoric that I think appeals to evangelicals who see themselves as being this embattled minority. Now, the leaders of this movement have ginned this up. There's no question about that. That's been one of their strategies from the very beginning, it seems to me. This whole notion that we're being victimized. And even, I think, on the abortion issue, my second book, it was a travelogue into evangelical America, and I went to Iowa for the Iowa precinct caucuses in 1988, and then the following week appeared in New Hampshire for the first primary. And I was interviewing these religious right activists, many of whom were very new to politics at that point. And I remember very clearly a conversation with the head of the Iowa chapter of Concerned Women for America. This is Beverly LaHaye's organization. And she looked at me with these kind of piercing blue eyes, and she said, "Remember, the most dangerous place to be is inside a mother's womb." And she's, she delivered that line in the kind of haunting way that I just tried to replicate. And again, I'm not questioning her sincerity, and she, she actually was a lovely person in many ways. But I after that experience, after being on the campaign trail there in 1988, I began to speculate that there was some sort of visceral, sort of symbolic connection that many evangelicals felt with the fetus, that is the vulnerability of the fetus. That they had just come out of really 50 years, half a century of political somnolence. And they were not part of the larger society, in part because they felt the larger society was hostile toward them. And so there was a way in which they had this sort of identification with the fetus. And I think that again feeds into this rhetoric of victimization, which again, I think helps to explain the improbable support for Donald Trump in 2016, 2020.
That's so interesting. I would have never thought of it that way. So more kind of relationship or interplay between evangelical and different groups. Somebody says, what is the interplay among evangelical political and religious interests and those of Israel and Palestine?
Oh, very close, and that's a whole other lecture. It has to do with evangelical attitudes or interpretations of the Bible, particularly the various apocalyptic books of the Bible, Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, but especially the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. And evangelicals have come to see that God favors Israel, has always favored Israel, and so we must as well. And there's a great deal of, I think there's a great deal of confusion, frankly, a fundamental confusion, if you'll allow me to use that term, between ancient Israel, ancient Israelites, and the modern state of Israel, which I think is arguably a different sort of entity. But you get all these, a lot of these preachers who kind of keep hammering on this. They were very much behind the movement of the embassy, for example, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and that sort of thing. And some of the more, I was about to say crazy, but that's a judgment term. More, well, I guess fringe groups are, plotting the destruction of the temple and breeding sacrificial animals and all that sort of stuff. But that's a minority. It's a smaller group.
Are there any Black evangelicals, and if
Yes.
so, what values do they embrace?
Yes, there are, and I think that it's a fascinating development because due to the tragedy of American history, what happened is that these two strains, even though they have many of the same beliefs theologically, tended to grow up in rather parallel tracks rather than intersecting tracks. And what that means is that there is much longer tradition of social activism associated with the Black church than there is with the white church, the white evangelical church. White evangelical activism is really quite recent, as I said, beginning in the late 1970s. Whereas for the Black church, the notion of separating social advocacy from and social action from theology or preaching is just, it's just a foreign idea. It's just not considered. why would you leave that out? That's part of the whole message of the gospel. Whereas white evangelicals, again, historically have tended to separate the two, and activism on their part is a fairly recent phenomenon. And they also tend to go in different directions in terms of the substance of their policies. Not surprisingly, African-American churches tend to be more interested in issues of economics, poverty, and the eradication of racism and that sort of thing than the white churches.
We have a question from Arthur, who asks, he has a theory kind of that opposing abortion on the grounds that one is pro-life is an easy way to take a self-righteous stand, when at the same time they might oppose integrationism or oppose adequate social safety net. Basically that
Sure.
They're pro prenatal life but not interested in the postnatal life.
Oh, sure. No, I think that's a legitimate observation. Occasionally I refer to this movement as the pro-birth movement, right? They're interested in birth, and then once the child is born, then they're willing to kind of abandon it, and talk about government staying out of these sorts of things. Now, they want government to regulate gestation, right? But once the child is born, then they want to stay out of that sort of thing. So yes, I think that's a legitimate observation. By the way, let me add this. My current project is a biography of Mark Hatfield, a Republican senator from Oregon from 1967 to 1997, an evangelical, a Baptist. And I made the point earlier in the conversation, and I stand by that point, that that abortion was a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s. Evangelicals didn't care about it. Actually, I'm coming on the basis of recent research just in the past few days to believe that the first evangelical to take a so-called pro-life or an anti-abortion position was the liberal evangelical Baptist U.S. senator from Oregon. 4 months after Roe v. Wade, he co-sponsored a resolution in the Senate that would have made abortion illegal. And it's very interesting to read his speech on that occasion, because I just read it a couple of days ago. And he said, if we are going to take this position, that means that we have to take responsibility for the nurturing of these childs. We have to reform the foster care system. We have to liberalize the adoption system, particularly for handicapped children and for mixed race adoption. He's saying this back in 1973. And we also have to recognize that if the government is going to take that stand, the government is also going to have to assume some responsibility for the economic well-being of these children who are being brought into the world. So it's a fascinating development. And at a time when most evangelicals were either silent on the issue or supported legalized abortion, this liberal, anti-war evangelical senator from Oregon is really the first anti-abortion evangelical, as nearly as I can tell.
All right, we have a question on bad faith. So they ask, how is the evidence of bad faith on the part of evangelicals if they were concerned not specifically about racial issues, but more generally about religious freedom? Why would they not be concerned about this issue? Is Yeshiva University exercising bad faith by not agreeing to a Pride Alliance group to form in its college, which is something that the Supreme Court may look into in the next term?
I'm sorry, the last part of that question, what was the last?
So I guess Yeshiva University is not allowing a Pride Alliance group to form in its college. And
Right.
So that might be making its way to the Supreme Court.
I see. Yeah, well, that will be interesting to see how that plays out. And I'm not going to try to predict these days how that might play out. Yeah, I think religious freedom is very important, and arguably Bob Jones University. I'm not pushing Bob Jones University by any stretch of the imagination, but in many ways they have done the honorable thing. That is to say, they continue to operate with their policies. They've ratcheted back a little bit on their racial policies, but they continue to operate, but they do so without tax exemption. And in many ways that they're being quite honorable. in doing that. They're not relying on public subsidy for their sorts of policies. And by the way, I just mentioned Hatfield. I'll mention him again. One of Hatfield's issues that he tried to push while he was a U.S. Senator was to do away with tax exemption for religious institutions. He thought that that was not necessary, and these institutions would be able to operate without having that benefit of tax exempt status. And he thought that was a better policy, more consistent with the Baptist tradition of the separation of church and state.
And just one more time, is that Mark Hatfield?
Mark Hatfield, yes. Mark Hatfield.
And we had somebody write in that the Supreme Court just ruled 8-1 that Yeshiva University has to allow the LGBTQ student organization. So thank you everyone for writing in and helping us here. Okay, going back up. Jean says that you have been engaged in discussions with evangelicals over all of these issues. Do you see any evidence of a movement toward the more prophetic vision that you hoped they would embrace? Or are they likely to continue to follow the authoritarian demagogues kind of that we see these days?
That's not a loaded question, is it? Yes, there is. People talk about a left wing of evangelicalism, and there is a left wing of evangelicalism. I mean, it's not, in most cases, not terribly radical, but I would think about the first name that comes to mind, it would be Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners, now at Georgetown University, having stepped away from Sojourners. Shane Claiborne would be an example of that. That is someone upholding the tradition of progressive evangelicalism. Tony Campolo has been on the ramparts for a long time. Ron Sider, who just passed away this summer. I actually did an op-ed on him this past Sunday. He's another example of a progressive evangelical. And I'm going to put Jimmy Carter into that camp as well, in part because I wrote a biography of Jimmy Carter. But Jimmy Carter is very much in that tradition of progressive evangelicalism. Now, the question becomes, if I can anticipate the follow-up question, why don't we hear more from these people? Well, I think the big reason for that is that they don't have the sort of media megaphone that people like Jerry Falwell did, or Pat Robertson, or Jim Baker, and these other televangelists, for example, or even the these modern, more contemporary religious right figures have a media presence that far outstrips that of those evangelicals who are a more progressive bent.
Can you talk a little bit more about why you don't refer to the group as the Christian right, but the religious right?
When I was a child and heading off to school, my mother used to say, now, if people ask you if you are religious, or if people say, what is your religion? You answer them, I'm not religious, I'm a Christian. And so for me, that term has always had a particular meaning and valence that the term religious does not. I am a person of faith. I am a few years ago, I was ordained as an Episcopal priest, and I do supply work all the time as an Episcopal priest. And so the faith is very, very important and precious to me. And to have my Christian faith associated with the movement that I do not believe embodies the teachings of Jesus, nor does it honor the rich heritage of Christian activism, evangelical activism from earlier centuries. I find that deeply offensive. So if somebody's going to use the term Christian to refer to this movement, I immediately want to know what they see as Christian about it. Think about the Trump immigration policies, for example, dealing with refugees at the border. How is that Christian? And in fact, if you dig deeper into that issue and you try to apply biblical teachings to the issue of immigration, it's going to throw things open. I mean, Jesus told us, and the Hebrew Bible tells us, to welcome the stranger, to treat the foreigner as one of your own. Well, I understand, we have to recognize and maintain borders and all that sort of thing. But if you take that seriously, that's going to have enormous policy implications for how you conduct yourself in the political arena. And to be honest, I don't find much that I would consider Christian in the agenda of the religious right. That's why I object to the term.
We have somebody who just wrote in saying that many have started to also shy away from calling themselves Christian and instead would say they're followers of Jesus Christ.
Followers of Jesus is becoming a rather popular phrase. And there's some folks who want to be cute that talk about ex-evangelicals. That is, I used to be evangelical, and the movement has gone in directions that I no longer recognize or honor, and so forth. These labels are tough. I propose the term sojourners evangelical or sojourners Christian. That's something that I'd be comfortable with calling myself, because I think Sojourners is a remarkable organization, and Jim and the other people behind it have been at it for a long time. They advocate for issues of poverty and racial equality and gender equality. They take seriously, I think, the words of Jesus and try to appropriate them. And they also are open to other religious traditions as well, informing their ethics. And I think that's quite admirable.
Thank you again, just for all of being so open with all of our questioners writing in.
Sure.
We do have still a few left in our last few minutes here.
Okay.
Carol asks that as the Supreme Court moves towards eliminating any significance to the separation of church and state, how do you see the evangelical movement affected? Will they just get stronger?
That's a great question. And I will argue the opposite. I am a passionate defender of the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. And the reason I am is that religion has flourished here in America, here in the United States, as nowhere else, precisely because of the separation of church and state. The person who came up with that metaphor, separation of church and state, wall of separation, is Roger Williams. He's the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. And he wanted to cordon off the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. And if you think about that metaphor for a moment, and you acknowledge that Roger Williams and his contemporaries in the 17th century were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, they did not share our romantic ideas about wilderness. When Roger Williams was talking about wilderness, that was a place where evil lurked. That was a place of darkness. That was the habitation of Satan. And so when he's trying to cordon off the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation, he's concerned about the integrity of the faith. And that's, I think, the huge mistake that the Supreme Court is making. It's the huge mistake that the religious right has been making now for 40 years, thinking that by collapsing that wall of separation, they're somehow going to, I don't know, unleash godliness in American society. That is, the opposite is going to happen. You're going to have a fetishization of the faith. And I'll give you an example of this. I was one of the expert witnesses in the Alabama 10 Commandments case. You'll remember back in 2001, when the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Roy Moore, plopped this monument in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, Alabama, emblazoned with the 10 Commandments. And he insisted at the same time that no other religious representation be in that space. No Hindu representation, Muslim, nothing else, just the 10 Commandments. And if he had allowed other representations, I wouldn't have any problem with it, but just the 10 Commandments. And when Judge Myron Thompson ruled correctly that represented a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and he ordered the removal of that monument, as the workers were prepared to take it away, one of the protesters, one of the religious right protesters, screamed, "Get your hands off my God." And unless I'm mistaken, one of those commandments said something about graven images. And that's precisely Roger Williams' point. If you allow the state to intrude upon the faith, and the two become so inseparable, it is the integrity of the faith that is going to suffer. So these recent Supreme Court decisions, I think, are regrettable, doesn't even begin to capture how bad they are. They are really unfortunate. And I think ultimately they will be unfortunate in the sense of compromising the integrity of the faith. And I'll circle back just to finish that thought with what I observed earlier, that I think the most effective religious movements in American history are movements that speak from the margins of society and not in the councils of power. Because once you begin to lust after power, you lose your prophetic voice.
So we had a question that came in early when we started doing the questions, and I think it's a good place to kind of, as we wrap up, what do you think will be the rallying cry of the evangelicals now that the abortion ruse is no longer a mobilization tool?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think I think I suggested earlier, I think it's going to have to be some issue related to sexuality, because that's what kind of gets people excited and motivated. I think in many ways they're going to struggle somewhat to find an issue comparable to the abortion issue, because that has been the real focus and the real energy for a long time now. And I think they're going to probably cast about for various things. Again, I think probably it's going to be something related to sexuality, would be my guess, at least. They'll probably try to, that's one of the things about evangelicalism is evangelicals are not afraid to try and fail. That is, they like innovation. They like novelty. So, they'll try something, and if it doesn't work, they'll give it up, and then they'll try something else. And so they'll probably cast about for a while, trying to find an issue that's going to gain some traction with their constituency. And I think, just I'll editorialize a little bit further. I think some of the folks on the left, with which I identify unabashedly, I think some of the folks on the left probably give them a little bit too much to work with, and in some of the positions that they're talking about and advocating, and they're playing into their hands. But I don't expect anybody to listen to me on that.
No, we've had multiple people already writing in saying that they've learned so much. It's all been very fascinating. So I just want to make sure that you know that, I know you can't see everybody in our audience, but we had close to 200 people for the entire time, just question after question coming in. So thank you again so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.
And we did record this event, and we will share the link tomorrow. We'll share the link to your book, and if you want to give us the link to the new one, we can also include that. But we have a bunch of people here, and again, lots of schools, continuous learners. So we have your books, but where can they go if they want to continue kind of reading on these themes?
Well, books are always a good place to start, I suppose. I do have a website. I try to keep up with it a little bit. I don't do a really good job with that, but I'll take a moment to say this. That is, when I went to graduate school at Princeton, I vowed that I would never allow my work to become so recondite that I couldn't communicate with the general audience. And so I began, even in graduate school, to develop the discipline of writing op-ed pieces. And so I do op-ed pieces regularly. LA Times picks some up quite often, Washington Post from time to time, Des Moines Register, Santa Fe, New Mexican, Concord Monitor, and so forth. So I do, I consider that part of my duty as an academic and a scholarship to communicate to a general audience. I usually think of the general audience as the kind of the NPR demographic. That's kind of where I'm focused. So yeah.
Well, I think you hit us on the nail on the head right there. And Bob already went out and bought the book in the last hour, so we got one. We are going to have an event about education and culture wars. So a lot of stuff coming up. We'd love to have you back. I just want to say my roommate and best friend at Columbia was a minor in religious studies. She took all your classes, and I heard all about you. So it was my honor to get to talk to you today. 2008 to 12 era. So nice to get to meet you officially. I'd love to give you the opportunity to close us out in the last couple of minutes. Any closing thoughts?
Keep the faith.
All right. Well,
and I mean that not merely in a religious sense. I mean, in the sense that there are important battles going on in our society right now, and I think we need to be engaged in it. And I keep the faith in the sense that we have to keep battling. There's a lot of ignorance and misinformation out there, and I think we can't ignore it. We have to stand up to it.
All right. Well, Professor Balmer, thank you again so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Again, we'll send out the link and all of that information tomorrow. And otherwise, everyone have a great night.
Thank you.